Picture a marketing meeting at a major consumer brand. The brief is on the table. The target audience needs to be defined. Someone says, "Let's go after Gen Z. They're the future. They set the trends. Get them young and you have them for life." Someone else says, "What about millennials? They're in their prime earning years. They have kids now. They're buying houses." A third person says, "Boomers still control enormous wealth. Don't write them off." The meeting wraps up. Target demographics are set. Campaign briefs go out. Nobody mentioned Gen X once. Not once. This is not a hypothetical. This is how marketing meetings actually go. Documented across the industry, noted in trade publications, confirmed in studies covering hundreds of brands across dozens of categories. Gen X, the generation currently aged 45 to 60, currently in peak earning years, currently responsible for 27% of all global consumer spending, gets left out of the conversation so consistently that the industry has started writing embarrassed reports about it. Only 4% of generation-specific research conducted by the advertising industry includes Gen X at all. Gen X appears in 4% of television advertisements, despite making up 31% of the global population. Only 13% of Gen X feel represented in the advertising they see. The generation is right there, spending real money, and the entire media apparatus is essentially pointing its cameras slightly above their heads. My name is Eddie Freeman. Every week on this channel, we cover the generational gaps nobody else is bothering to examine. Why are they like that? Subscribe and you get a new one every week. To understand how Gen X ended up invisible in media, you have to understand the machine that creates media visibility in the first place, advertising, and how it decided which generations matter. The advertising industry has operated on a specific demographic logic for decades. The target is 18 to 49. That's the sweet spot. That's where brand preferences are formed, where new products get tried, where the future of consumer behavior gets shaped. Everything outside that window gets deprioritized. This logic made some sense when it was invented in the 1960s and 70s. It made sense for the broadcast television era when you were buying audience in bulk, and the demographics of that bulk mattered enormously. The problem is, the logic calcified into dogma. The 18 to 49 target became so baked into how the industry thought about audiences that it stopped being regularly interrogated. It just became the assumption. And that assumption has been producing increasingly bad results for a very long time without anyone changing the fundamental approach. Gen X got caught in a specific demographic trap that had nothing to do with their actual commercial value. When they were young, 18 to 34, the advertising industry was focused on boomers. Boomers were the largest generation in history, and their spending power was the dominant fact of consumer economics for 3 decades. Gen X was always the smaller, quieter cohort sitting in the boomer shadow. They got some attention, but were never the primary target. Then millennials arrived. 83 million of them, the largest generation since the boomers, with enormous amounts of cultural volume and media coverage. The industry pivoted. The think pieces about millennial consumers were endless. Every brand was asking how to reach millennials. The obsession was total and lasted the better part of a decade. By the time that wave crested, Gen Z had arrived, and the industry pivoted again. Now everything was about Gen Z, their values, their platforms, their attention spans, their spending habits. Another endless cycle of coverage and research and campaign briefs. Gen X sat between these two enormous generational waves and got attention from neither. Too old to be included in the millennial conversation, too settled to generate the fresh audience excitement of Gen Z. In the industry's perpetual quest for the next new thing, the generation currently in the room with the most money got stepped over twice. The financial absurdity of this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the numbers are genuinely hard to explain. Gen X accounts for 27% of global spending. They are on track to inherit an estimated $70 trillion from boomers, the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history. 87% of Gen X feel underrepresented in TV advertising, despite being on track to become the wealthiest generation of all time. Gen X accounts for only 5% of brand spending on influencer campaigns, despite making up 28% of TikTok's user base. Only 4% of generation research conducted by the advertising industry includes this cohort. That last number is the most remarkable. The industry is spending 96% of its research budget understanding generations that are either younger and have less money, or older and exiting their peak spending years. The generation currently at peak earnings, peak spending power, and on the edge of the largest inheritance in human history is essentially being studied as an afterthought. When Gen X does see itself represented in advertising, something interesting happens. When Gen Xers see their generation reflected back at them, it doubles their brand preference. They are not a hard audience to win. They are a loyal audience that responds strongly to being acknowledged. The brands that figured this out quietly have been harvesting that loyalty for years. The majority of the industry hasn't noticed. The media invisibility runs deeper than advertising. It runs through film, television, and cultural narrative too. The generational conversation in media is almost entirely a three-way argument between boomers, millennials, and Gen Z. Boomers are either heroes who built everything, or villains who broke the economy, depending on which platform you're reading. Millennials are either the burned-out victims of a broken system, or entitled avocado toast complainers. Gen Z is either the salvation of progressive values, or the most fragile generation in history. Gen X is not a character in this story. They appear occasionally as a footnote. And then there's Gen X, the forgotten middle child. And then the piece moves on. The cultural products that defined Gen X, grunge, alternative rock, slacker cinema, the early internet, are treated as nostalgia now rather than as the output of a generation that is still alive, still working, still culturally engaged. The 52-year-old who was 19 when Nevermind came out is not a museum piece. They are a present-tense consumer with disposable income and opinions and preferences. But the media ecosystem largely talks about them in the past tense, if it talks about them at all. Part of the explanation is structural, and part of it is Gen X's own fault, if fault is the right word. The structural part. The media industry is disproportionately staffed by millennials and younger people who are naturally oriented toward their own generational experience and the generations they interact with daily. Gen Z is their younger sibling or their new colleague. Boomers are their parents. Gen X is their somewhat older colleague who doesn't make a fuss about anything and therefore doesn't generate much editorial urgency. The Gen X part. They genuinely don't demand visibility. The same cultural DNA that makes them shrug at generational warfare makes them shrug at being left out of generational conversation. They are not making TikToks about being ignored by advertisers. They are not writing op-eds about media underrepresentation. The complaint that might generate coverage and prompt a response is the exact complaint their generation's psychology makes it hardest to lodge. The irony is almost architectural. The reason Gen X is ignored is partly that they don't perform the distress of being ignored. The generations that get covered are the ones who produce content about their own experience. Gen X produces content about everything except their own generational identity, which they find slightly embarrassing as a concept. So the media machine, which runs on content, has very little Gen X content to amplify. There's a piece of this story that advertising researchers have identified, but brands have been slow to act on. Gen X is not just wealthier than millennials and Gen Z right now. They are about to become substantially wealthier. The $70 trillion wealth transfer from boomers is not evenly distributed across generations. Gen X, as the immediate next generation, receives the first and largest wave. The Gen X household that already has solid earnings and savings is in many cases also waiting to inherit a significant asset. The generation that brands have been underinvesting in for 20 years is about to have more money than any generation in history. And the brands that figured this out early, that built relationships with Gen X audiences before the rest of the industry noticed them, will be positioned to capture a loyalty that Gen X is known for delivering once it's earned. Trust is 30% more important to Gen X than to younger generations when making purchasing decisions. They consider fewer brands than younger consumers before committing. They are not browsing. They are not casually experimenting with new products because of a TikTok trend. When they decide on something, they tend to stay decided. That is an extraordinarily valuable consumer profile. The industry has spent 20 years pointing its cameras somewhere else. The Gen X response to all of this is entirely predictable and entirely consistent with everything else about them. They know they're being ignored. The research showing that only 13% feel represented in advertising is a survey of Gen X people. They answered those questions. They are aware of the situation. They just don't particularly care. Or they perform not caring well enough that the distinction is invisible from outside. One Gen X marketing professional quoted in a trade publication put it with characteristic economy. We're used to it. We were ignored as kids, we were ignored as young adults, and now we're being ignored as wealthy middle-aged consumers. At this point, it would be weird if we weren't. That response, delivered without apparent bitterness, is the entire generation in one sentence. They are the most financially valuable ignored audience in the history of consumer media. They know it. They're fine with it. And somewhere in the background, quietly, without making it a whole thing, they're spending their money on the brands that bothered to show up. If you're Gen X, be honest. Does being ignored by media and advertising actually bother you? Or have you genuinely stopped caring? And from every other generation, when did you last see something clearly made for a Gen X audience? Tell me what it was.